Hello class and welcome back. So for today's lesson, we're going to be focusing in on a specific region during the Cold War, China. So if you would, please title your notes for today, Maoist China. So as we've discussed previously, the Cold War really is a series of symbolic engagements between the Western world and the countries that are going to ultimately fall to communism and be influenced by the Soviet Union. So you'll see by the end of today how China, in a sense, becomes a proxy conflict for these two competing ideologies. Don't forget the Cold War is all about these invisible confrontations, these symbolic confrontations, and China is going to be no different. So, after the end of the Second World War, you're going to see the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, ultimately win out in their civil war against the Nationalist Party, the KMT, also known as the Kuomintang. So you may be wondering what was going on in terms of the civil war throughout World War II. Actually, both of these competing sides put their differences to the side for the time being, and they joined together to fight the Japanese. Don't forget, Japan had invaded China during their early acts of aggression. Think of the rape of Nanking, the invasion of Manchuria. So obviously the CCP and the KMT are going to momentarily put their differences aside to fight this common enemy. Once World War II ends, of course, they're going to fight each other again, and ultimately it's going to be Mao who is victorious. Okay? So during the Civil War and during the Japanese invasion of China, it's really the Communist Party that are going to be looking out for the peasants. They protect the peasants from Chinese raiders, from invaders, and that ultimately wins them a lot of support among the common people. Mao Zedong is going to use that to his advantage to ultimately declare victory against Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. So, we talked about Mao Zedong previously, but by October of 1949, Mao is going to be the official leader of China. He's the leader of the CCP after his long march around the outskirts of China, and he commands a massive military regime known as the Red Army. China is at this point going to be renamed the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, the name that it still technically holds today. China continues to be one of the most powerful nations in the world, and you'll see by the end of this year how it really transforms itself from this country that's suffering profoundly as a consequence of imperialism and foreign conquest to one of the most powerful nations in the world. So, after the Civil War comes to an end, China is literally going to split in two. And you'll see that the communists have the majority of control over mainland China, but there are going to be many who are not going to be happy with the communist ideologies that are going to take root in the country. So those who support the nationalists are going to set up camp in Taiwan, and then those who support communism are going to remain in mainland China. That's the PRC, the People's Republic of China. So how is this going to play into the Cold War? Don't forget, the Cold War is all about these clashing ideologies between capitalism and communism. And you're seeing here very plainly how those two different camps are going to meet each other. So the Western world is going to support Taiwan, obviously, and the USSR is going to support the People's Republic of China, both of them providing money and supplies to fight the enemy. Don't forget, Cold War is all about these invisible confrontations. This is what's called a proxy conflict, where essentially the ones who are really pulling the strings are not right there on the stage. In this case, it's the USSR and the United States, but the conflict is playing out with these smaller players, in this case, the nationalists and the communists. So we're going to talk about Korea in more detail once we get to the Korean War, but just to give you a little taste of where this is headed, this is another example of two different worlds converging with each other. So basically, as Japan falls to the Allied powers, it's going to be divided up by the US and the USSR. Don't forget, Korea is one of Japan's colonies, as well as Manchuria, so the actual colony of Korea gets split in the middle as well. So the South, or the North I should say, is supported by the Soviets. The South, on the other hand, is supported by the United States. So capitalism versus communism. United States versus the Soviet Union. And Korea to this day is a consequence of this history. Capitalism taking root in the South, in South Korea, and then communism taking root in the North. It's going to be divided at the 38th parallel, and you'll see once we get to the Korean War, it's really all about pushing past this boundary. The communists pushing south, and the capitalists pushing north. So Mao's goal for the Chinese economy is largely based on Marxist socialism. Earlier in the year, when we talked about the Industrial Revolution, we talked about Karl Marx and his ideas about communism and socialism, and how the proletariat, the lower class, would eventually rise up, and that basically everyone would become equal and life would be much improved for common people. In reality, that's never really what seems to be the case. At the time, though, 10% of the population owned almost all of the land in China, so what Mao envisioned was this land being seized and then redistributed to people, basically to even the playing field. As this happens, though, you'll see that corruption largely sets in, and people really do not achieve equality at all. In fact, their lives become much, much worse. Mao installs collective farms or cooperatives. These should sound familiar to you. Joseph Stalin is going to use the same exact strategy in the Soviet Union. Basically, people's resources, their tools, their crops, everything is pooled together by the government. The government skims some off the top and then redistributes it back out to the people. Additionally, corporatism is used as well, where businesses are taken over by the central government as well. Again, this is supposed to promote equality. In essence, though, that's not really the case. So Mao implements what's called the Great Leap Forward. He wants to compete with the Western world in terms of economic productivity, but he doesn't want to do it in the traditional capitalist way. So he wants to do this very fast in a very similar fashion to Stalin's 5-year plan, and you'll see that similarly, it's going to negatively impact the peasants in a quite dramatic fashion. He wants to increase the output of coal, of cement, electricity, and it's going to quadruple. However, at what cost? The quality of what is being produced and the conditions at which it is actually being made become absolutely abysmal. Of course, propaganda is commonly used in any totalitarian regime, so you can see here peasants are being portrayed as heroes, as these people riding this wave toward the future. You can see someone literally riding a rocket in the background. You can see instead of traditional weapons, tractors are their weapons, and farm equipment, and flour, and hay. In reality, this is not what the Great Leap Forward truly looked like. It was actually an economic disaster. By 1958, these collective farms became what are known as communes, which are basically massive farms where no one actually owns the farm itself. It's owned by the government, and everyone is just basically working outside all day to produce these materials. In reality, the Great Leap Forward is considered a great leap backward by historians. It dramatically takes China in the wrong direction. Peasants become absolutely miserable in their lives. Mao basically uses production battalions, which are like young officers that will go to these massive communes to make sure that everything is being kept in order. They seize all of the materials from the people. Think of like a similar case to the famine in the Ukraine, where Stalin was doing this to peasants there, and then they're supposed to redistribute them, but in reality, people get very little food. In total, between 20 and 40 million Chinese people died during the Great Leap Forward. Again, in these cases, we really have no understanding of how much life was lost. There was no value placed on human life, and there are very little records of those who have actually perished, so we're actually guessing in this ballpark of 20 million people. To show you what the Great Leap Forward actually looked like in comparison to that propaganda poster, you're just seeing people in these massive communes producing materials in these cement vats. You can see they're trying to produce materials here. Again, conditions abysmal. People lost limbs, burned themselves, died, fell in the vats. This is what a commune would look like as well. You're saying that these are cement creation vats on the sides. These are all people trying to produce things in these massive fields. Conditions, again, just absolutely terrible. So the question becomes, we talked about genocide this year, we talked about the Holocaust, we talked about the definition of genocide, the intent to eradicate a people. But I mean, you're talking about millions and millions of deaths, which are so obviously caused by this policy. So the question for you becomes, is this a genocide? And if not, how do we really quantify this horror? So lastly for today, Mao is also going to implement what's called the Cultural Revolution. Think about the other totalitarian dictators we've talked about this year. Think about Joseph Stalin, right, trying to erase all of Russia's czarist past, destroying the Romanov statues, the paintings. Think of Hitler destroying all of the Weimar Republic. Mao is going to do a very similar thing in China. He urges millions of high school and college students, many of them with no futures, nothing really holding them down, no families, to form these small militias. And if you don't know what militias are, they're basically like small, like militaries, fighting forces of like groups that band together, usually with weapons, to enforce the policies of the government. So those who are actually in these militias are known as the Red Guards, and they're going to be the ones who oversee this cultural revolution. The goal is to completely eradicate society of all traces of old Chinese traditions and cultures and bring about complete equality in China. Essentially, help Mao realize his vision of this Marxist socialism where everyone is equal, and it's basically this utopia. In reality, they just bring absolute fear and misery to people. They raid people's homes, destroy Buddhas and Hindu statues, and symbols of Confucianism, and everything is just absolutely destroyed. This is a picture of what Red Guards would typically look like. They carried these little red books around, as they were called, that contained all of Mao's ideologies, his philosophies, and they would wear these uniforms as they raided the houses of Chinese citizens and basically terrorized them. This is a cemetery of where Confucius was buried. According to legend, it was destroyed by the Red Guards in 1966. This is a map of Beijing showing all of the streets that the Red Guard were patrolling, again wreaking havoc on the public and implementing Mao's policies. These are statues of Buddhas. Again, their faces are removed because the Red Guards were basically removing all traces of old Chinese traditions or cultures. So again, how is Mao going to sell this to the public? How is he going to get the people on his side? He portrays peasants as these heroes, like almost like superheroes, who are changing China and making them this fighting force to compete with the Western world. Among all of the citizens, he considers intellectuals to be the most dangerous. Anyone who was a scholar or tried to question Mao or his policies would be exiled or jailed or condemned to hard labor. Again, you're seeing a lot of similar attributes to Stalinist Russia. Think of the gulags. Anyone who threatened his regime could be sent to these prisons, never to be heard of again. And of course, conditions in China continue to worsen as the idea of nationalism and communism continued a civil war that had been going on for decades and decades. So just to wrap up for today, what is the legacy of Mao? This is another symbol of the Cold War. You're seeing two different ideologies competing, in this case, on the stage of China. By 1968, even Mao admits that the Cultural Revolution is not working. People are becoming very restless. Civil war is starting to mount and become more prevalent, and ultimately he's forced to call it off. He tells the federal government, the Red Army, to basically stop the Red Guards, and it actually leads to a conflict between two different groups who were originally supporting Mao, and bloodshed breaks out all over China with these young kids, these high school students and college students, basically being put down by the federal military. So, to really wrap up for today, while China is going to remain largely unstable under Mao and going forward, two more wars are going to emerge in Asia that are similarly going to demonstrate this symbolic tension between the Eastern and Western world, the USSR and the United States, and that's going to be in Korea and Vietnam.